The question is, could Madison occur in Canada? And I think the legal part of it is handled very well, and I agree the charter of Canada makes it more difficult to happen. But here's what worries me. If I have my numbers right, during the last election, the Conservatives are going to reduce the corporate tax rate down to 15%, which is the lowest in the OECD. We're going to have the lowest corporate tax rate. How are we going to sustain our public services? How is it possible? And this isn't popular, by the way. There was a poll taken. I'm sorry, it seems to be the pollster. 52% of Canadians don't want the tax cut. But you know, he's doing it. He's going to do it because that's our parliamentary system. How are we going to pay for our public services? Are you going to pay more? Because you're going to have to pick up the slack. Corporations are paying less and less, and it's going down from here. So it is about capitalism. It is about the model that we've adopted. And these things are kind of sneaking through, but I think the pressure is going to be enormous. This is going to be a future crisis. And we're all going to be coming back here saying, how did it happen here?
Okay, so moving on from there, I'm going to ask Sam, going forward, we talked about some of the problems. What should unions do?
Go for the easiest question in the world. Well, I just want to repeat one thing that I said earlier. Obviously, as Bob said, you're in bargaining, you have to confront things, you've got your members to represent, you scramble, you do what you can. But one of the things we have to actually honestly say to ourselves is that there isn't just a crisis out there. Everything that Bob described is accurate. There's a crisis in here. And we can't really, unions won't change until they actually acknowledge that instead of simply blaming it, for a very good reason, on others. And one of the messages to the members isn't that we're asking you to think up here instead of down here. It's that you can't fix things down here. It's actually saying that if you want to have some different options in your life, you have to think bigger. This is how people politically develop. They come against barriers. And they want to get around those barriers. You don't give them illusions about, well, if you're just a little bit more militant, or if you stay around with the strike longer, you'll solve that problem. So it becomes a very difficult question. One of the things I'd like to hear some discussion on, in terms of Madison, is it's exciting about what happens when people are in motion, but I'd like to hear more about how it's sustained. What happens after the moment? Because that raises questions about, well, what kind of organizations do we have to sustain that? What do people do who want to continue to struggle? And if they just go back to their unions, what do they do in their unions now? And what do they do when they come up against the same problems in the unions? So I'd like to hear some discussion about that. If you're thinking about the trade unions, one of the key things in the private sector is that the most important thing to workers in the private sector is, as you say, Elaine, hanging on to things, but the way you hang on to things is you want your job. So the job is the most important thing, and that's not what unions can provide you. Unions don't provide jobs. So there is this dilemma in the private sector about if you can't deal, how do you deal with that question? Okay, so that's not on the agenda, we're talking about public sector, but it's something I'd really like to talk about. In the public sector, it seems to me that there's an obvious strategy that has emerged, which is that unions have to become the leaders in the fight for social services. This is the strategic question. Of course you're going to fight concessions, of course you're going to fight for working conditions, but the key strategic question, the way you're going to develop the power and the capacity and the support to win anything, is going to be by showing that you can lead the fight around social services. And social services are important to everything. It's your job, but it's also your workload. When you talk to public sector workers about social service cutbacks, one of the main things is about working conditions at work. Now the point about this is I think that most unions will acknowledge that. I haven't met any trade union leaders who would disagree with that. But it translates into better PR, passing more resolutions, having bumper stickers, when the real problem is that the public doesn't believe you. They think you're just being opportunist. Of course now you're saying you believe in services. The unions are going to have to prove this. And that's the challenge for unions. And to prove it means that you have to change how you bargain. You can't say, well, that's another issue, and then we're going to bargain as usual. You actually have to say, we're going to put on the bargaining table the quality and level and the administration of services. We're going to have to say, we're not just going to defend the government as if the government is good, we're actually going to be whistleblowers. We're going to represent the public by saying there are lousy things about the government and the state and the way those things are provided. We'd like to prevent it, to do it better. Public sector unions are organizing. Well, you have to decide that you're going to organize in a collective way. It's not a question of who gets the members, it's a question of whether you're building the working class. And as long as unions are just competing with each other, you're not going to make the breakthroughs that everyone is talking about. It means changing everything about unions. It means that you change, if you have a research department, you begin to ask, what is our research department doing? It means you take a look at your budget and you say, what are we spending money on? And when you raise these things, there's two levels that you always have to operate at. One is, we actually have lousy capacities, as Elaine said, at the local level. Unions actually, there's a lot of potential at the local level, but we haven't built those kinds of capacities. So on the one hand, there's an enormous amount of, we have to become organizers again. That's the challenge. And so there's this enormous challenge at the very local level to develop organizing capacities, and the kind of organizing capacities that can go into the community. And it isn't just coalitions. We have to be careful about this, because coalitions are about taking two movements that are pretty good and putting them together and thinking then you have something great. Well, the reality is we don't actually have a lot of great movements. They're there on paper, but there's not much actual movement there. And if the unions aren't in great shape, you put these two things together, you're not going to have much more than what you started with. The issue is that you've got to change both. You've got to change the movements and you've got to change the unions. And it's not just thinking about how do unions link up with people in the community, it's how do unions, workers, think about other dimensions of their lives? Because they're not just workers, they live in the community, etc. So one question is local organizing, and then there are these other questions. So I want to throw one other part into this. The left always used to think in terms of socialist parties, particularly radical socialist parties, as they're necessary to make a revolution. I want to state something more modest, which I think is also radical, and that is that we actually need some kind of an organization outside of unions to renew unions. I don't have much confidence that unions just fighting on their own, rank and file fighting on their own, are going to transform their unions. It's not just a question of union leaders being a problem. There's too many activists. First of all, there are activists who have actually learned that it's quite comfortable to tell the members that there's nothing you can do. It's not my fault, don't blame me, or we'll have a strike and get wheeled back to work, and that settles that. And then there's rank and file members who are incredibly cut off. It's very difficult, given people's lives, to organize. It is very difficult to sustain things. There are all kinds of fights going on. People are ready to fight, but the real question is how do you sustain fights and how do you build on them? And I think that can't happen unless you have a larger organization that has its feet in the unions and outside. It's something we're trying to do with the Greater Toronto Workers' Assembly with mixed results so far. But I think a critical question for us in reviving unions, in addition to thinking about how strategically we fight around services, is how do we create the kind of organizations that can make networks across unions, across workplaces, and can actually start developing organizational capacities in the communities.
I wanted to ask Elizabeth a question that relates to one of the issues that's been sort of front and center, and that's pensions. A lot of the discussion on some of these attacks have been about pensions and how we just can't afford the kinds of pensions unions are asking for. So, Elizabeth, do you think that public sector workers in Canada should be worried about their pensions?
Well, I guess everybody in Canada should be worried about their pensions. I'm going to suggest that public sector workers need to be less worried about the pensions than most other workers for a variety of reasons. I think generally what's called vested pension rights that you've already earned are better protected in Canada than they are in the U.S. And their primary threat is employer insolvency, and that's certainly something that public sector workers, by and large, do not have to be concerned with. But in the context of what we're talking about tonight, the real problem for public sector pensions is that they have become such a red flag in taxpayer movements, and this idea of the gold-plated Rolls-Royce public sector pension that I, the taxpayer, am paying for but don't have. Why should I be doing that? Now, I don't know how many of you out there are public employees and how many of you have pensions. For a lot of you, if you have pensions, they're probably not gold-plated pensions, because the classic gold-plated pension is the teacher's pension and the public servants pension defined benefit pension plans. But a lot of unionized workers in the broader public sector, even those who have pensions, don't have very good pensions. But nevertheless, there is this perception that the public sector is milking the taxpayers through their pensions, and it's not the pensions that they're looking for. It's not the pensions they're putting on the bargaining table. It's the pensions they already have. So the attack again would be a takeaway. So to the extent it was a takeaway with respect to collectively bargained rights, I say the same thing about it that I said more generally, that I think this would fall under the general heading of the takeaways that governments would be quite wary of doing, although they that might not stop them in the end. But one of the things I really wanted to comment on was not as much the takeaway phenomenon as this as another phenomenon that that is now widespread in the public sector, which is the move from the employer-sponsored pension plan to the jointly sponsored pension plan. And this has been going on, I guess, the last 20, 25 years maybe, a while anyway. And it's quite ironic that governments have been so anxious to all of a sudden form partnerships with unions around the governance of pension plans, because pension plans were one of the things that historically had been very much on the list of issues that governments were not even prepared to collectively bargain about, that they were very much in management's rights realm. The governments valued their control over pension plans as part of the way they structured incentives for certain kinds of public service careers, and suddenly, 20 years ago, 25 years ago, all of a sudden that started to matter a whole lot less than these joint partnerships, which then put public sector unions on the hook for, and public sector employees on the hook for the a share of any funding deficits, and so control was a lot less important than not having to pick up the tab for funding shortfalls. And this is also something that is starting to move beyond the big pension plans, and employers are now much more willing to talk about these joint governance strategies. And I'm going to be Pollyanna on this too, because I think that what we see here is both an opportunity and a trap, that I think unions have to be awfully careful about getting involved in these kinds of partnerships. But I also think that there is some potential out there in getting involved in pension partnerships to gain some control over, not just over benefit design and longer-term security of pension plans, but also over investment policy in ways that might give unions control of capital in ways that could be deployed in socially useful kinds of ways. But there are also pitfalls, which are, of course, the fact that unions can then share the blame if things go wrong with these pension plans, and also the some serious risk of co-option, which we've probably seen in other jointly sponsored pension plans, where union nominees who get involved on pension boards all of a sudden cease to represent their members and take on the mantle of so-called fiduciary responsibility, which ends up persuading them that they really should do things the way management has always done things, because that's how you manage large sums of money. So, as I say, I think there are both some threats and some opportunities out there, and some potential for organizing different forms of pension provision that could spread beyond simply workplaces where unions have exclusive bargaining rights under Wagner Act models, and where employees who are not represented for collective bargaining purposes could become involved in union pension schemes.
Yes?
I'd like to get into the control of pension issue, but I'm going to leave that so we can have some questions. But I do want to say that if I were a public sector worker, I'd be very worried. And not for the, I think you're right about the economic reasons, but for the obvious political reason. I mean, one of the things we have to confront is the fact that there is a lot of inequality within the working class. Never mind just the class inequality. And that means that people's resentment against workers do have some material base. They see people who have things that they don't have. And I don't think that isolating pensions to public sector workers is possible. I don't think they have they will never have the support in defending them unless they're at the same time fighting for pensions for everybody. And that's the challenge. And if they don't do that, they're not going to hang on to